Hello. Today we're going to think about the nature of an effective language lesson. First of all, I'd like to consider what you think some of the features of an effective lesson are. Of course, good teaching is sometimes described as both a science and an art. I suppose it's a science in the sense that there are certain features of effective lessons that can be objectively identified through careful investigation and research. But teaching can also be understood as an art, since it also depends on the individual skill and creativity of the teacher. And this differs from one teacher to another. For me, while an effective lesson engages the students and provides opportunities for all the students to participate and learn, it also gives the learners something they can take away from the lesson and makes the experience of coming to class worthwhile. Now I'd like to explore some ways of clarifying our understanding of the features of an effective lesson. Perhaps you can think of an effective lesson that you taught or experienced recently. Why do you think it was successful? Maybe think about some of the items that I am going to share with you here and consider how you would rank them. For example, was the lesson successful because the students enjoyed it, because it moved at a good pace, because it was well organized, it had a variety of different activities, it challenged the students but not too much, perhaps it made connections with the students' lives and interests, perhaps it taught them things they needed, there was a good atmosphere in the class, it was at the right level, and the content was relevant and interesting. So, from a list like that, which would you say were the three most important things that contributed to the effectiveness of a lesson that you have recently experienced or taught? Now, let's think about how you teach. When you teach, do you follow a set of mental rules or principles that guide you as you plan and teach the lesson? For me, two of my most important principles are, firstly, learning English is hard work, but it can also be fun. And another one would be get out of the way as soon as possible and let the students do their thing. Perhaps that you could think about the three rules that you try to follow in your own lessons. What experience or beliefs are they based on? Do you always refer to them, or do you sometimes have to create a new one for a particular situation? Now, let's think about some of the different aspects of a lesson and how we could extrapolate a principle for each of these lesson features. For example, if we have one aspect of the lesson that relates to the role of the teacher, what would be an example of a principle that relates to the role of the teacher? Well, it could be the teacher does not dominate the lesson. Now, what about some of these other features of a lesson, the role of the students? Can you think of a principle there that you would try to implement in your teaching? Or a principle related to the teacher's use of English, or the student's participation, or the student's use of English, or the feedback the teacher provides to learners, or the use of the textbook or other materials, or that relates to the activities used in the lesson, to the content of the lesson, its dynamics, and the class climate. So if you manage to come up with a principle for each of those features of a lesson, you might like to think of what are the 5 most important principles that account for a successful lesson, and how could these principles be realized in classroom practice. For example, if you said, as a principle, the lesson provides a success experience for learners, what would be a realization of this? Well, perhaps activities are at the right level and can be successfully completed by all the students in the class. When the lesson is over, they feel a sense of having made progress. Let's switch to thinking about skill-based lessons. What rules or principles do you refer to for skill-based lessons such as a reading, writing, speaking, or listening lesson. Here are some of my principles for different skill lessons. For a reading lesson, the lesson teaches rather than tests reading. For a writing lesson, the lesson develops fluency as well as accuracy. For a speaking lesson, students get a maximum amount of talking time. For a listening lesson, the activities relate to real-world listening purposes. Now let's think about designing a lesson plan. What are the features of a lesson that should be included in a lesson plan? Do you use a lesson plan, in fact, when you teach? Is it a written plan or a mental plan? I guess mine is more often the latter, unless I'm teaching unfamiliar content or an unfamiliar class. But let's consider some of the features of a lesson plan and compare different formats for lesson plans. Firstly, what is the role of a lesson plan? Do you agree with these statements? That a successful lesson must follow a lesson plan? That if you have a lesson plan, you should follow it? That you don't need a lesson plan if you're using a course book? That only novice teachers need lesson plans? That a lesson plan should start with the objectives of the lesson? That a mental plan is better than a written plan? That a detailed lesson plan is a restriction for a teacher? That teaching is a personal activity, so it's better to plan lessons on your own? Or that you can't teach from someone else's lesson plan? So which of those statements do you agree with? These days, I should say, my own planning consists of reviewing a lesson to anticipate problems and finding ways of making it as interesting as possible. Most often I use a mental rather than a written plan. Most lesson plans have 3 stages: the opening stage, the instructional stage, and the closing stage. The opening stage can help prepare learners for the lesson. The instructional stage is where the main teaching takes place, while the closing often serves as a brief review of the lesson. Perhaps you can suggest other purposes for the opening and closing phases of a lesson. Let's think about a few lesson scenarios and the kinds of activities you could use for each stage of a lesson. For example, a lesson on the past tense for basic level learners, or a 1-hour discussion class for students at advanced levels, or a listening lesson using video clips of a news broadcast. What might be the 3 stages of each of those lessons? Now, let's think about a lesson plan that a teacher submitted for a lesson on the past tense. Here's the teacher's lesson plan. What do you think of it? Do you think it can be improved? If so, how? The teacher begins by distributing a story with key verbs omitted. Secondly, students try to guess the missing words. Then the teacher reads the story. Students check their answers. Fourthly, teachers write up verbs from the story with both present tense and past tense forms. Then students complete sentences with past tense verbs. The students then receive another story. The sentences are in the present tense but not in the correct order. Students work in pairs to unscramble the story and to provide the correct past tense forms. So, what are your thoughts about that lesson plan? Would you use the same lesson plan yourself, or would you modify it or use a different one? Now, perhaps you'd like to work with a colleague and prepare a lesson plan for a lesson of your choice. And your plan should address these questions. First of all, what will be the objectives of the lesson? Secondly, what kinds of activities will the students do during the lesson, such as dialogue work, free writing, brainstorming, depending on the lesson focus, sequencing, Sequencing, what activities will be used for the opening, instructional, and closing stages of the lesson. Timing, how much time will be spent on each activity. Grouping, when will the class be taught as a whole, and when will they be taught in pairs or groups. Resources, what materials will be used, such as the textbook, worksheets, or the internet. Evaluation, what procedures will be used to determine the effectiveness of the lesson. And then think back on your lesson plan. What issues did you need to resolve?